Let's check out the liberal road to socialism. Many of my prior videos have explored leftist critiques of capitalism, and as you might expect, these videos are rooted in leftist philosophical thought. However, there is at least to me, pretty surprising tradition of liberal philosophers using liberal first principles like freedom, independence, security, to actually arrive at a critique of capitalism and a support for socialism, or at least something very close to socialism. This is especially interesting to me because liberalism is the intellectual foundation for capitalism. So when you see folks of that liberal tradition using that intellectual tradition to critique capitalism, it suggests that capitalism itself may not only be in contradiction with leftist philosophical thought, but to a significant extent, it may also stand in contradiction to liberal philosophical thought. Let's explore that a little bit. The first liberal philosopher that we'll be taking a look at is John Rawls. John Rawls, who passed away back in 2002, was one of the preeminent liberal philosophical thinkers of the 20th century. One of his most famous thought experiments is that of the veil of ignorance, which we can see illustrated here. So essentially, the veil of ignorance thought experiment says that you ought to decide on how society should be structured from a position of ignorance, specifically ignorance about who you would be in that society. So, to the left, we sort of have these anonymous stick figures that have no idea of who they're actually going to be beyond the veil of ignorance pictured in the center on the right. On the right, we can see folks of different skin colors, different genders. There's folks with disabilities, without disabilities, the young, the old, and so on. The point being that the society you would structure with no knowledge of what your role within that society would be will more closely approximate a just and virtuous society. For a long time, this meant folks thought he was essentially an advocate of the Scandinavian model, and in favor of realizing essentially a slightly imaginary Sweden. However, the Scandinavian model actually didn't go as far as he personally advocated. Now, he never really hammered out the specifics about what he was looking for in an ideal society, but we know it fell somewhere in between, on the right, a property-owning democracy where private property still exists, but is distributed in a radically egalitarian way. So egalitarian, actually, that any meaningful differentiation between capitalists and workers is erased. And that's kind of the rightward bounds of where his beliefs fell. And then on the leftward bounds of where his beliefs fell, he advocated for what was essentially a liberal democratic socialism, where most of the means of production are publicly owned and firms themselves are democratically controlled with decentralized power running them, which is very much a distinctly socialist model for how to run a nation. So here we have one of the literal titans of liberal philosophical thoughts from the 20th century, in essence, advocating for borderline socialism or even outright socialism itself via the public ownership of the preponderance of the means of production. This trend of big-name liberal philosophers arriving at essentially socialistic positions goes back even further than John Rawls, though. If we go back to the 19th century, we can see that John Stuart Mill, the preeminent English language philosopher of the 19th century, and one of the biggest names in the liberal intellectual tradition, also essentially ended up with some pretty socialistic positions. Now, John Stuart Mill is probably best known for his contributions to the utilitarian school of moral thought, which essentially says that which is good produces the greatest amount of good for the greatest number of people. And it is famously explored in the trolley problem, which is rather morbidly and ironically illustrated right here. In J.S. Mill's 1873 autobiography, he expresses a support for what he refers to as qualified socialism. But what does that mean specifically? Well, first of all, he felt that we ought to prioritize a steady state economy rather than an economy characterized by perpetual growth. Additionally, he felt that it would be much better for firms to be worker-owned and worker-managed rather than owned by essentially external investors and managed via a hierarchical top-down command and control structure. Finally, he was strongly in favor of extraordinarily steep taxes on inheritance and all unearned income. Unearned income essentially is any sort of money you make outside of the work that you actually do, essentially the money you make on your capital. Now, obviously, this is not quite fully out and out socialism, but it has some very distinctive socialist features, especially with the democratic control of the means of production within firms themselves. As someone that takes intellectual foundations seriously, both in terms of examining the traditions in the world around me and in taking a look at my own beliefs, I think this is a very interesting line of critique on capitalism because it uses capitalism's own avowed ideals against it, which is about the most damning sort of philosophical critique that you can get, because it essentially is saying capitalism is incompatible and self-contradictory to the very ideals it claims to support and draw from within the liberal tradition. I actually think this is a pretty good line of attack, and it holds some weight for me. But I'm curious about what all of you think. I know this is kind of getting into some philosophy and intellectualism, and it's pretty far removed from the day-to-day life. But any time a belief can be shown to be self-contradictory, I think that is definitely worth taking a look at. Anyway, that's been our very quick examination of the liberal road to socialism. If you liked this video, like, comment, subscribe, yada, yada, yada. You know the drill. I have a Twitch stream. The link is in the description. We go into way more detail than this. And as always, I hope you have a fantastic day. And until my next video, peace.